September 12, 1943, 11:47 a.m. 24,000 feet above New Guinea. A Japanese Zero explodes in a ball of fire and black smoke. The pilot never even saw it coming. 1 second he was flying. The next second, he was gone. Nothing but burning wreckage spinning toward the jungle below. And the American fighter that killed him was already climbing back into the blinding sun, invisible, patient, and hunting for the next target. Nobody on the ground knows his name yet. Nobody in Washington is talking about him. He is not a decorated general. He is not a career military man. He is a 21-year-old farm boy from Poplar, Wisconsin, who spent his teenage years hunting white-tailed deer in the forest and plowing fields before sunrise. He has no fancy tactics manual, no advanced degree in aeronautical engineering. What he has is something that cannot be taught in any classroom on Earth: a cold, predatory instinct for the exact moment to pull the trigger. By the end of this war, that instinct will produce 40 confirmed aerial victories, a number so shocking, so far beyond anything any other American pilot will ever achieve, that the United States Army will literally order him to stop fighting because they cannot afford to lose him. 40 enemy aircraft destroyed. 200 combat missions survived. One record that still stands unbroken more than 80 years later. But right now, in the smoke-filled skies above New Guinea, nobody knows any of that yet. Right now, he is just a quiet kid with extraordinary hands and a revolutionary idea that every senior officer around him thinks is completely insane. This is the story of Richard Ira Bong, and it starts with a world on fire. By the summer of 1942, the Pacific War had become a nightmare that American military planners had not fully prepared for. Imperial Japan had spent a decade building one of the most battle-hardened air forces in the world. Their pilots had been fighting since the invasion of China in 1937. Many of them had logged hundreds of combat hours before the first American pilot ever fired a shot in anger. They were not rookies. They were not amateurs. They were killers who had spent years perfecting their craft. And their primary weapon, the Mitsubishi A6M0, was terrifying. Light, agile, and with a turning radius so tight it seemed to defy physics, the Zero could dance circles around almost anything the Allies threw at it in a close-range dogfight. American pilots learned this lesson the hard way, repeatedly, over Guadalcanal, over Rabaul, over the Coral Sea. Young men who climbed into their cockpits with confidence and aggression came down in burning pieces because they made one fatal mistake. They tried to turn with the Zero. American bomber crews were suffering catastrophic losses. B-17s and B-25s, flying daylight missions over Japanese-held territory, were being torn apart before they could reach their targets. Fighter escort pilots, who tried to protect them by engaging Japanese Zeros in traditional turning dogfights, often ended up dead themselves, which meant the bombers were left even more exposed. The numbers were brutal. In certain periods of the campaign, American air crews over New Guinea were facing loss rates that commanders refused to publish because the truth would have destroyed morale on the home front. The problem was not courage. American pilots had courage in extraordinary abundance. The problem was tactics. The entire framework of American fighter combat doctrine had been built around aircraft and opponents that simply did not match the reality of fighting the Zero over the Pacific. Generals argued. Commanders wrote reports. Committees formed. And while all of that was happening, young men were dying every single day in skies that America had not yet figured out how to control. The solutions being tried were not working. More aircraft, more pilots, better guns, better engines. All of it helped at the margins, but none of it addressed the core problem. As long as American fighters were engaging Zeros in slow-turning fights at low altitude, the outcome was predictable. Japan had more experience, more agile aircraft, and more veterans. America was bleeding in the air, and the people responsible for fixing it were still thinking in the old way. But somewhere in the training pipelines of the Army Air Forces, a young man with mud still metaphorically on his boots was about to walk onto an airfield and see the problem in a way that nobody else had thought to look at it. And his solution was going to be so simple, so aggressive, and so brutally effective that the senior officers who heard it would first laugh, then argue, and finally watch in disbelief as it changed everything. Richard Bong was born on September 24, 1920, in Superior, Wisconsin, the oldest of 9 children in a Swedish-American farming family. His father, Gust Bong, worked the land with the methodical patience of a man who understood that results came from discipline and repetition, not luck. His mother, Dora, ran the household with quiet efficiency. It was not a glamorous upbringing. It was early mornings, hard work, cold winters, and the kind of self-reliance that city kids never needed to develop. What Richard Bong learned on that farm was the foundation of everything he would later become in the sky. He learned to be patient. A farmer cannot rush the seasons, cannot force a crop to grow faster by wanting it badly enough. He learned to read conditions, weather, light, wind, and make decisions based on what was actually happening rather than what he wished was happening. And he learned to hunt. In the forests around Poplar, Bong spent countless hours tracking deer and other game, mastering the art of approaching a target without being detected, positioning himself for a single shot, and making that shot count, because in hunting, as in aerial combat, ammunition and opportunity are both finite. By the time he was a teenager, Bong was absolutely obsessed with aviation. He spent whatever money he could save on flying lessons at a small local airstrip, working extra jobs to afford time in the cockpit. His instructors noticed something immediately. The young man from the farm had hands that moved as if they already understood what the aircraft wanted to do. The feedback loop between his brain, his eyes, and his control inputs was unusually fast and unusually precise. He did not fight the aircraft. He moved with it. When the United States entered World War II following Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Bong enlisted in the Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Program without hesitation. He was 21 years old, barely finished with his basic flight training, and burning with the same restless energy that had driven him to the cockpit in the first place. His instructors gave him glowing reviews. His fellow cadets noticed that he flew differently from everyone else, not recklessly, but with an absolute certainty of movement that most pilots spent years trying to develop. He was assigned to Hamilton Field in California, where he encountered for the first time the aircraft that would define his legend. The Lockheed P-38 Lightning was unlike anything else flying in 1942. Twin engines mounted on twin tail booms, a central nacelle housing the pilot and the guns, and a performance envelope that left conventional single-engine fighters looking timid by comparison. It climbed fast, flew high, and carried a concentrated battery of weapons in its nose: 4 50-caliber machine guns and a 20-millimeter cannon, all firing in a tight, devastating stream straight ahead. Most young pilots were intimidated by the P-38. It was complex. Its twin turbo superchargers were temperamental and required careful management. At high speeds in a dive, it could develop a terrifying phenomenon called compressibility, where shock waves built up around the wings and literally locked the controls solid, sending the aircraft into an unrecoverable plunge. Pilots died learning to handle it. The lightning demanded respect. Bong gave it respect, and then started probing its absolute limits with the quiet intensity of a hunter studying his prey. He did not just fly the P-38. He interrogated it. He pushed into corners of the flight envelope that other pilots avoided, learning exactly where the boundaries were and exactly how much he could demand from the machine before it started pushing back. This is also the period that nearly ended his military career before it began. Stationed at Hamilton Field, Bong began performing unauthorized aerobatic maneuvers that would have gotten almost any other pilot immediately grounded. He flew his P-38 down Market Street in San Francisco so low that people on the sidewalk could read the markings on the fuselage. Then he performed a complete loop around the Golden Gate Bridge, threading a 50-foot-wide corridor between the bridge cables and the water's surface at several hundred miles per hour. Official reports described these as violations of military flight regulations. That was technically accurate, and almost completely missing the point. What Bong was actually doing, though neither he nor his commanders had the language to describe it this way at the time, was developing an intimate physical knowledge of his aircraft's performance at the absolute edge of its capabilities. He needed to know, in his body and his hands rather than in his head, exactly what the P-38 could do when asked to do things that no manual had ever described. The Golden Gate Loop was not showing off. It was a laboratory experiment conducted at 300 miles per hour by a 21-year-old genius who had not yet learned how to explain himself in terms that would satisfy a general. General George Kenney was not a man who tolerated recklessness. As commander of the 5th Air Force, he bore personal responsibility for every aircraft and every pilot in his command. When Richard Bong was brought before him after the San Francisco incident, Kenney expected to find the kind of arrogant, glory-seeking hotshot that gave commanders headaches in every war. What he found instead stopped him cold. The young man standing at attention in front of him was not arrogant. He was not seeking attention. He was quiet, almost uncomfortable with a confrontation. And when he spoke about the aircraft, about what it could do, about how it responded, about the specific aerodynamic behaviors he had been studying. There was no swagger. There was only absolute confidence in the mechanics of flight and the capabilities of the machine. Kenney had been around aviation for his entire professional life. He had seen talented pilots. He had seen brave pilots. He had rarely seen a pilot who understood aircraft the way this farm kid from Wisconsin understood aircraft. He dressed Bong down thoroughly and put the reprimand on record. Then he made a decision that would change the course of the Pacific Air War. He kept Bong in his command. He assigned him additional training. And he began thinking about how to point this unusual young man at the problem that was bleeding his Air Force's white over New Guinea. The critical insight that would make Bong the most dangerous fighter pilot in American history arrived not in a briefing room or a tactics seminar, but during his first weeks of actual combat over New Guinea in late 1942. He watched. He listened. He studied the gun camera footage from missions that had gone wrong. Missions where American pilots had done everything they were trained to do and still died. The pattern was clear to him almost immediately, and it was devastatingly simple. Every American pilot who got into a turning fight with a Zero at low altitude lost the energy advantage that the P-38 was designed to exploit. The Zero's light construction and enormous control surfaces gave it a turning radius that the heavier, more powerful American fighters simply could not match at slow speeds. But at high speeds and high altitude, the equation reversed completely. The Zero's light airframe became a liability. Its engine, optimized for low-altitude performance, struggled above 20,000 feet. And its controls, so responsive at slow speeds, became dangerously heavy and imprecise when the aircraft was moving fast. Bong's idea was so straightforward that when he first described it to other pilots, several of them told him it was too simple to actually work. It was not a trick. It was not a secret weapon. It was physics. Climb above the enemy. Always maintain altitude advantage. When the moment is right, convert that altitude into speed by diving. Fire a short, precise burst. Not a long spray, a short burst aimed with surgical accuracy at the exact point where the enemy aircraft is going to be a fraction of a second from now. Then use the aircraft's momentum to climb back to altitude before the Japanese pilots can react. No turning fights. No lingering in the target area. No attempting to match the Zero's maneuverability on its own terms. Strike fast. Strike hard. Disappear back into the altitude from which you came. The entire engagement, from the beginning of the dive to the moment Bong was climbing safely away, might last 4 seconds. 4 seconds of exposure. 4 seconds for the enemy to react. By the time Japanese pilots understood what had happened, the fork-tailed silver fighter was already a tiny speck thousands of feet above them, invisible against the blinding Pacific sun. His commanding officers listened to this. Several of them nodded politely, and then suggested he follow established doctrine. Estado doctrine was killing American pilots at a rate that should have been unacceptable. Bong went back to his aircraft. He refined his approach. He practiced his deflection shooting, the nearly impossible skill of firing not at where an enemy aircraft is, but at where it will be when the bullets arrive, with a patience and repetition that bordered on obsessive. And then, on a clear morning over Buna in November 1942, Richard Bong executed his tactic for the first time in actual combat. The results were immediate, spectacular, and impossible to argue with. By December, he had 5 confirmed kills, making him an ace. By early 1943, the number was climbing with a regularity that was beginning to attract attention from every level of command. Japanese pilots began noticing something terrifying. High-speed attacks appearing from directly out of the sun. Impossible deflection shots that seemed to arrive from angles that should have been safe. Aircraft destroyed so quickly that the pilots flying beside them barely had time to react before the shooting was already over. The enemy gave the strange, twin-tailed American fighter a name. They called it the Fork-Tailed Devil. They did not know the name of the pilot inside it, but they knew that when that aircraft appeared above them, someone was going to die. On the nose of his P-38, Bong had painted a single word and a smiling photograph. Marge. The name of the girl back home in Wisconsin, who wrote him letters he read a dozen times each. In a war full of savage machinery and calculated killing, Marge was a reminder of what all of it was supposed to be protecting. By the spring of 1943, Richard Bong had 14 confirmed aerial victories. He was 22 years old. He was methodical, quiet, and growing more lethal with every mission. And somewhere in the operations center of the 5th Air Force, General Kenny was looking at gun camera footage and combat reports, and beginning to understand that the farm kid he had almost cashiered from the service was about to become something the United States had never produced before. But Bong had not yet faced the test that would make or break everything he had built. Somewhere over the Pacific, Japan's most experienced surviving aces were being assembled for a massive counteroffensive. They had studied the reports about the fork-tailed devil. They had developed countermeasures. They were coming in numbers that would challenge every instinct Bong had developed. And somewhere in the growing stack of classified intelligence reports crossing General Kenny's desk was information about that counteroffensive. Information so alarming that Kenny was already drafting orders that Bong was going to hate with every fiber of his being. Because the Americans had a problem. Richard Bong was now too valuable to risk. And what Kenny was about to tell him would change everything. Richard Bong had 14 confirmed kills, a revolutionary tactic that was working, and the commanding general who finally believed in him. But believing in a farm kid from Wisconsin and actually letting him rewrite the combat doctrine of the entire 5th Air Force were two completely different things. Because standing between Bong's tactics and the pilots who desperately needed them was something more dangerous than any Japanese Zero. It was the United States Army Air Force's bureaucracy. And in the spring of 1943, that bureaucracy was about to make Bong's life hell. The number you need to understand is this. In March 1943, American fighter pilots over New Guinea were losing aircraft at a rate that senior commanders were quietly classifying to keep out of newspapers. For every 10 missions flown against heavily defended Japanese positions, the attrition was unsustainable. Young men were dying, not because they lacked courage, not because their aircraft were inferior, but because the doctrine they were following was built for a different war, against a different enemy. Bong had the answer. The system had the power. And the system was not interested in being told it was wrong by a 22-year-old who grew up milking cows in Wisconsin. Brigadier General Ennis Whitehead was a man who had spent decades earning his authority in the Army Air Forces. He was not stupid. He was not lazy. He was experienced in precisely the way that sometimes makes experienced men the most dangerous obstacle to necessary change. He had seen young pilots come through with revolutionary ideas before. Most of those ideas got people killed. His job was to manage an air campaign, not run experiments. When Bong's after-action reports began landing on his desk with their clean clinical descriptions of the dive and climb tactics and their extraordinary kill-to-loss ratios, Whitehead's first reaction was skepticism, calibrated to match his rank. The meeting happened on a morning in April 1943 at 5th Air Force Headquarters in Port Moresby. Bong stood across a folding table from two colonels and Whitehead himself, his gun camera footage queued up on a field projector that kept flickering in the tropical heat. He was calm in the way that only people who are completely certain of their data can be calm in front of people who outrank them by several orders of magnitude. "Lieutenant," one of the colonels said, not looking up from the report in his hands, "you're describing a tactic that requires pilots to disengage from a fight before it's finished. You're asking them to run." "I'm asking them to survive, sir," Bong said. "Running and surviving are different things." Whitehead leaned back in his chair and studied the young pilot for a long moment. "Son, I have pilots with 10 times your experience who will tell you that a fighter pilot who breaks away from a dogfight is a fighter pilot who gets shot in the back." "With respect, General," Bong said quietly, "the pilots with 10 times my experience are the ones flying the old doctrine. I can show you their gun camera footage, too. A lot of it ends before the camera stops running." The silence in that room lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt like 4 minutes. Whitehead did not throw him out, but he also did not approve anything. He told Bong to submit a formal written proposal through proper channels and dismissed him with the kind of polite finality that experienced officers use when they want a conversation to be permanently over. The proposal went into the system. The system processed it with the speed of a glacier moving uphill. Meanwhile, over Wewak and Leh and Finchhofen, American pilots kept flying old doctrine, and Japanese fighters kept killing them with it. The urgency was not abstract. Every week the proposal sat in someone's inbox was another week of casualties that better tactics might have prevented. Bong knew this. He flew his missions, added to his kill count, and waited. But the waiting was eating him alive. The unexpected ally arrived in the form of Major Thomas Lynch. Lynch was not a farm kid, and not quiet. He was aggressive, politically connected within the 5th Air Force, and had enough combat kills of his own to make senior officers listen when he walked into a room. More importantly, He had been watching Bong fly for 3 months, and what he had seen had converted him completely. Lynch believed in the dive and climb tactic not as a theory, but as a survival tool he had personally used and personally verified. He had the credibility Bong lacked, and he was not afraid to spend it. Lynch went directly to General Kenny, not through proper channels, directly. He sat across from the most powerful air commander in the Pacific and made the argument that Bong's written proposal could not make on its own, which was that this was not an academic question. This was pilots dying right now in avoidable ways. Kenny had already half believed in Bong. Lynch's intervention gave him the push he needed to act over Whitehead's skepticism. The compromise that emerged was characteristically military. There would be a formal evaluation, one structured demonstration under controlled observation. Senior officers would watch. Results would be measured against established benchmarks. If the numbers justified adoption, the tactics would be formally incorporated into 5th Air Force doctrine. If the demonstration failed or produced ambiguous results, the matter would be closed and Bong would fly the rest of the war following established procedure. One chance, one demonstration, in front of the men who had the power to either change everything or bury it permanently. The conditions were brutal. Bong and Lynch had 2 weeks to design and execute a demonstration that would be observed by Whitehead's staff, 2 visiting colonels from Army Air Force's headquarters in Washington, and General Kenny himself. The weather over New Guinea in that period was characterized by unpredictable squalls, poor visibility, and the kind of turbulence that made precise aerial demonstration nearly impossible. They had 3 aircraft, 4 junior pilots who had been briefed on the tactics, and 0 margin for error. The morning of the demonstration, May 19, 1943, began with rain. Not the brief tropical rain that cleared in 20 minutes, but the serious, low-visibility rain that grounded missions and canceled operations. The assembled observers sat in folding chairs under a canvas awning at the edge of the strip at Dobadura, watching gray clouds pile against the mountains to the north, and saying nothing. One of the visiting colonels from Washington had already been heard telling another officer that this entire exercise was a waste of everyone's time. Bong sat in the cockpit of his P-38 and watched the weather. He did not fidget. He did not get out and pace. He watched the clouds the way he had watched the forests around Poplar as a teenager, reading the light, reading the wind, reading the movement of the mass and finding the gap. At 9:47 in the morning, a window opened. Not a large window, but enough. He keyed his radio. Lynch, now. 3 P-38s rolled onto the strip and launched within 90 seconds of each other. 2 additional aircraft flying aggressor rolls climbed to 10,000 feet and began flying patterns designed to simulate Japanese formation behavior. The observers came out from under the awning. The rain had lightened to a drizzle. The clouds had broken enough to provide 3,000 feet of clear air below 15,000 feet of overcast. What happened in the next 11 minutes was methodical in a way that stripped all the drama out of it and replaced drama with something more powerful, which was pure, undeniable data. Bong positioned his flight at 14,000 feet, above and behind the 2 aggressors, using a cloud layer to conceal the approach. The observers on the ground tracked him on a plotting board as a controller with binoculars called out positions. When the aggressors made their simulated bombing run, Bong initiated his dive. The P-38 descended at over 400 miles per hour, closing the distance to the target aircraft in less than 8 seconds. A short burst from simulated gun runs was marked by smoke tracers. First pass, clean engagement, breakaway, climbing before the aggressor could react. Time of exposure in the target's defensive cone, less than 4 seconds. Second pass, Same geometry, different angle, catching the aggressor in the moment of its turn, exactly where Bong had predicted it would be, based on its previous flight pattern. Another clean, simulated kill. Breakaway. Climbing. Third pass. Now the aggressor pilots, briefed to fly defensively, attempted to use turning maneuvers to deny a clean shot. It did not work. Bong waited. He did not dive when the angle was wrong. He repositioned, burned 30 seconds finding a better geometry, then dove again. The shot was clean. The aggressor, attempting a tight defensive turn, was precisely where Bong's deflection calculation had placed it. 11 minutes. 3 simulated engagements. 3 clean kills. 0 passes where the attacking aircraft spent more than 5 seconds in a position where a defending fighter could have engaged it effectively. The colonel from Washington, who had declared this a waste of time, was standing at the edge of the runway with his arms crossed and his mouth open. He had been watching fighter tactics demonstrations for 15 years. He had never seen anything that looked like what he had just watched. The plotting board showed a pattern so clean and so repeatable that it looked less like combat and more like a mathematical proof. Whitehead turned to Kenny without saying anything for a long moment. Then he said, "He's right." 2 words. They cost him nothing and changed everything. Formal adoption moved faster than anyone expected. Within 3 weeks, Bong and Lynch were running tactics clinics at operational squadrons across New Guinea. The resistance they encountered was real. Veteran pilots who had been flying their own way for a year did not change habits easily. Some of them were openly contemptuous. One senior pilot, at a briefing in Milne Bay, told Bong directly that climbing away from a fight went against every instinct he had spent 2 years developing. "Keep those instincts," Bong told him. "They'll keep you alive on the way home. It's the first 2 seconds of the engagement that need to change." By August 1943, squadrons that had converted to the dive and climb doctrine were reporting kill-to-loss ratios that were 3 times higher than the 5th Air Force average from 6 months earlier. Japanese combat reports began noting a new pattern of American fighter attacks. High speed, high angle, impossible to track, impossible to counter with turning maneuvers. Japanese pilots were being killed before they understood the geometry of what was happening to them. Bong's own kill count by September 1943 stood at 21 confirmed victories. The tactic that had been called insane by colonels in April was now official 5th Air Force doctrine by September. The farm boy had won the argument. He had won it not with paperwork or politics, but with 11 minutes of perfect flying on a rainy morning in New Guinea, and a kill ratio that no senior officer could explain away. But here is the problem with winning an argument in wartime. Winning makes you visible. And visibility in wartime has consequences that Richard Bong was not prepared for. Because General Kenny had been watching the kill count climb all through the summer of 1943, and somewhere around victory number 20, he had started doing math that had nothing to do with aircraft, and everything to do with propaganda value, morale, and what happens to a nation's spirit when its greatest living war hero gets shot down over a jungle that nobody in Wisconsin can find on a map. Bong was about to be pulled from combat, not as punishment, as protection. And the order that was coming down from Kenny's desk was going to feel to Richard Bong like the most devastating blow he had taken since the war began. Because the one thing this quiet farm kid from Wisconsin could not survive, the one thing that genuinely terrified him, was not enemy fighters. It was sitting still while other men fought the war he had spent everything learning how to win. And somewhere over Wewak, a Japanese commander was reading the intelligence reports about the fork-tailed devil and the new American tactics. And he was not panicking. He was planning. Because Japan still had veterans in the air, and they had just figured out that the best way to stop Richard Bong was not to outfly him. It was to make sure he never got to altitude in the first place. Richard Bong had gone from a farm kid with an idea that colonels laughed at to the architect of official 5th Air Force combat doctrine. His kill count stood at 21. His tactics were being taught at every operational squadron across New Guinea, and the Japanese were watching all of it. They had been watching for months, and what they saw in the gun camera footage their intelligence analysts were studying, footage recovered from downed aircraft and pieced together from survivor reports, was not encouraging for the Empire of Japan. The fork-tailed devil was no longer one pilot flying one tactic. It was an entire air force that had changed how it fought. And by the autumn of 1943, Japanese commanders in the Pacific were beginning to understand the scale of what that change meant for their chances of winning. The intelligence reached Imperial Japanese Navy Air Force headquarters in Rabaul in September 1943. The numbers in the report were not ambiguous. In the 6 months since American fighter squadrons had begun adopting the dive and climb doctrine in significant numbers, Japanese air losses over New Guinea had increased by 61%, while American losses had dropped by 38%. That gap, nearly 100 percentage points of relative effectiveness, represented not a tactical disadvantage, but a structural collapse in the logic of Japanese air combat superiority. Vice Admiral Junichi Kusaka convened an emergency meeting of his air group commanders at Rabaul on September 21st. The mood was not panic. Japanese commanders at that level did not permit themselves panic. But the assessments delivered in that meeting were grimly honest in a way that Japanese staff briefings rarely were. The Zero's superiority in turning combat was the foundational assumption of every air engagement Japan had planned since 1937. That assumption was now irrelevant. The Americans had stopped turning. They had moved the fight to a vertical plane, where the Zero's greatest strength was neutralized, and the P-38's greatest strengths, speed, power, and concentrated firepower, were decisive. Kusaka's response was layered. First, Japanese fighter pilots were ordered to deny American aircraft the altitude advantage at all costs, climbing to intercept before enemy formations could establish position above the Japanese formations. It was logical. It was also extraordinarily difficult to execute reliably, because the P-38's supercharged engines gave it a climb rate that most Japanese fighters could not match at high altitude. Second, intelligence assets in the region were tasked with identifying the airfields where the new tactics were being trained, with the implicit objective of disrupting the training pipeline before it produced more pilots who fought like Bong. Third, Japan began accelerating development of the A-7M Repu, a successor to the Zero, designed to address the altitude and speed deficiencies that the American tactics had ruthlessly exploited. None of these countermeasures were immediately effective, but they signaled something important. Japan was no longer dictating the terms of the air war over the Pacific. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, Japan was reacting. That shift in initiative, from dictating to reacting, was a strategic change whose consequences would compound over time in ways that no single battle would fully capture, but that the cumulative record of the next 12 months would make undeniable. What nobody on the American side had fully anticipated was the internal pressure that success would generate. By October 1943, the 5th Air Force was processing requests from 7 different squadron commanders who wanted Bong personally assigned to their units to run tactics training. The logistics of that demand were impossible. Bong was one man flying combat missions while simultaneously being expected to train, advise, and certify pilots across an operational theater that stretched over thousands of miles of Pacific jungle and ocean. The strain produced friction. Not all of it was personal. Some of it was institutional. There were senior pilots, experienced men with genuine combat records, who had built their reputations on their own approaches to air combat, and who did not appreciate being told by a 22-year-old that their methods were contributing to unnecessary casualties. One incident at a squadron briefing in October 1943 nearly escalated into a formal disciplinary complaint. A major with 15 months of Pacific combat experience stood up during Bong's tactics presentation and told the assembled pilots that the dive and climb approach was a coward's tactic. That a fighter pilot's job was to stay in the fight, not run away at the first opportunity. Bong looked at him for a moment. "Sir," he said, "how many of your pilots did you lose last month?" The answer was 4. Bong's squadron had lost 1 in the same period, while logging more kills. The major sat down. The briefing continued. But the harder problem arrived in November, when a P-38 executing a high-speed dive attack over Wewak suffered compressibility lock, the shockwave phenomenon that froze the controls at high velocity, and the pilot was unable to recover. The aircraft struck the ground at full speed. The pilot was 20 years old. His name was written into the accident report and into the quiet grief of the men who had flown with him. And suddenly, there were voices in the command structure asking whether the tactics being pushed by Bong and Lynch were being taught with sufficient emphasis on the aircraft's limitations. The accusation was not entirely unfair. The dive and climb tactic worked with extraordinary reliability in the hands of pilots who understood the P-38's compressibility threshold and respected it. In the hands of pilots who pushed the dive too steep or held it too long, the same maneuver could be lethal. Bong knew this. He had been teaching the recovery technique at every clinic. But teaching a technique and guaranteeing its execution under combat stress were different problems. The accident triggered a formal review that consumed 3 weeks and produced a revised training protocol that added explicit compressibility avoidance procedures to the tactics curriculum. 3 weeks. In a war where every week produced its own arithmetic of survival and loss, 3 weeks felt like an eternity. And then everything changed on November 2nd, 1943. The Battle of Oro Bay was not supposed to be the moment that validated everything. It started as an intelligence intercept. American signals analysts identified a large Japanese air formation staging out of Rabaul. Approximately 100 aircraft, a mix of Zero fighters and Mitsubishi G4M bombers, targeting Allied shipping and supply lines along the New Guinea coast. The attack was designed to sever the logistics chain that was feeding the American ground advance toward Finschhafen. General Kenny committed every available P-38 in the region, 43 fighters. Bong led one of the main intercept flights. The orders were simple: protect the shipping. The tactics were the ones that had been drilled into every pilot for the past 4 months. The Japanese formation was first spotted at 9:14 in the morning, 30 miles out, approaching at 12,000 feet in tight formation. The bombers in the center, Zeros layered above and below. Standard Japanese attack geometry. The kind of formation that had been devastating Allied shipping for 2 years. Bong's flight was at 19,000 feet, 7,000 feet above the enemy, already climbing when the contact report came in, already positioning with the sun behind them. He waited. That was always the hardest part. The instinct was to dive immediately, to close the distance and engage before the enemy reached the ships. Bong suppressed it. He watched the formation's movement, calculating its path, identifying the moment in the bombing approach when the bombers would be most committed and most exposed, when they could not easily maneuver, when their escort Zeros would be focused on the threat level rather than the threat above. That moment arrived at 9:22. Bong rolled his P-38 inverted and pulled through. The aircraft dropped from 19,000 feet toward the Japanese formation at over 400 miles per hour. 8 seconds of controlled fall, the airframe vibrating at the edge of its compressibility limit. His thumb on the firing button, his eyes reading the geometry of the approaching target with the same cold precision he had used reading deer trails in Wisconsin. He fired at 700 feet of range. Short burst. Precise. The G-4M bomber in his sights erupted in a sheet of orange fire and black smoke. He was already pulling through, climbing, before the debris had finished falling. Behind him, his flight executed the same maneuver with the discipline of pilots who had practiced it until it was automatic. First pass. 3 bombers down. Breakaway. Climb. The Japanese escort Zeros reacted. They turned upward to engage, exactly as trained. But turning upward to chase a P-38 climbing away at maximum power was a race they could not win. The American fighters were already 6,000 feet above them by the time the Zeros completed their defensive turns. Second pass. 4 more bombers destroyed. Bong fired through a cloud of debris from a Zero that another P-38 had destroyed a half-second earlier, the wreckage filling his windscreen for one terrifying instant before he was through it and climbing again. Third pass. The Japanese formation was breaking apart. Bombers that had maintained discipline through the first 2 passes were turning, jettisoning their bomb loads, attempting to exit the target area. Without the bombs, they were simply large, slow aircraft over the ocean, with nowhere to hide. Without the tight formation, the Zero's defensive coverage collapsed. The engagement lasted 19 minutes from first contact to the point where the surviving Japanese aircraft turned definitively for home. When it was over, 42 Japanese aircraft had been destroyed or so heavily damaged that they did not return to Rabaul. 3 American pilots were killed. The shipping at Oro Bay was untouched. Every ship that was supposed to deliver supplies that morning delivered supplies that morning. Bong's personal score from the engagement was 3 confirmed kills. His flight had accounted for 11 of the 42. The kill ratio for the entire American formation, 43 aircraft against 100, was 14-1. That number, 14 Japanese aircraft destroyed for every American aircraft lost, was not a statistic. It was a verdict. The after-action report crossed Kenny's desk that evening. He read it twice. Then he picked up a pen and wrote one sentence in the margin that would be quoted in official histories for decades afterward. "This is what we came here to do." The news moved through the 5th Air Force in hours. By the following morning, it had reached MacArthur's headquarters. By the end of the week, it was in signals traffic bound for Washington. The Battle of Oro Bay was not a famous engagement. It would not appear in most general histories of the Pacific War. But within the professional community of American military aviation, it became a reference point that defined before and after in ways that no single previous engagement had managed. Squadrons that had been resisting the new tactics stopped resisting. The major who had called it a coward's approach sent Bong a written request for a full tactics clinic at his squadron. Kenny authorized 3 additional P-38 groups to accelerate their conversion training. The revised curriculum, incorporating the compressibility procedures, was distributed to every fighter unit in the theater within 10 days of the battle. Across the Pacific, between November 1943 and March 1944, American fighter squadrons flying the dive and climb doctrine recorded a kill-to-loss ratio that was 4 times higher than the theater average from the first 2 years of the war. Japanese air power over New Guinea did not collapse in a single dramatic moment. It bled. Mission by mission, week by week, The experienced pilots who had built Japan's air superiority were killed or wore out, replaced by younger men with fewer hours who flew into the same geometry and died in the same way. By December 1943, Bong himself stood at 21 confirmed victories and counting. The Medal of Honor recommendation was already moving through the system. General Kenny had already begun the political effort to have Bong recognized at the highest level. The farm boy from Wisconsin had not just built a tactic. He had changed the physics of the air war over the Pacific in a way that would shorten the campaign by months and save thousands of lives that would otherwise have been spent under skies controlled by Japanese fighters. But here is what the after-action reports and the statistics and the official commendations could not capture. What happened to the man himself once the war was decided and the killing was done, and the country that had consumed 4 years of his life asked him to come home and be something he had never wanted to be? A symbol, a poster, a celebrity. The smiling face on a bond drive instead of the cold eyes above a gun sight at 20,000 feet. Richard Bong had 40 kills and a chest full of medals, and a girl named Marge waiting in Wisconsin. He had everything the war could give a man who fought it the way he fought it. And very soon, he was going to discover that the most dangerous thing the United States Army Air Forces could do to him had nothing to do with combat. The most dangerous thing they could do was take him out of the cockpit and ask him to survive peacetime. That final chapter of his story, the one that nobody talks about when they talk about America's greatest ace, is the one that changes everything you thought you understood about what it costs to be the best. A farm boy from Wisconsin had gone from flying loops around the Golden Gate Bridge to building the tactical doctrine that broke Japanese air power over the Pacific. Richard Bong had 40 confirmed kills, a record that no American pilot would ever surpass, and a war that was finally, unmistakably, turning in America's favor. His dive and climb tactics had been adopted across the entire 5th Air Force. His name was in every headline. His face was on every Bond poster. But the question nobody was asking in December 1944, the question that matters most when the guns go quiet, was a simple one. What happens to a man who is built entirely for war when the war no longer needs him? Because the story of Richard Bong does not end with victory. It ends with something far more complicated and far more human. General Douglas MacArthur's order came down on December 17, 1944. Bong was permanently removed from combat duty. Not suspended, not rotated out temporarily. Removed. The order used language that made the reasoning explicit. America's greatest living fighter ace was too valuable as a symbol to risk in combat. The mathematics of morale had outweighed the mathematics of aerial warfare. Bong could kill more Japanese aircraft than any pilot alive, but the propaganda value of keeping him alive and photographable exceeded his value in the cockpit. He was 24 years old, and his war was over whether he wanted it to be or not. He did not accept it quietly. He argued. He wrote to Kenny. He made the case with the same calm precision he brought to his gun camera footage, that his place was in the Pacific with the men who had fought beside him. Kenny listened and held firm. MacArthur's order was not a suggestion. Bong was going home. The journey back to the United States felt to Bong like flying in the wrong direction. The country that received him was exhausted and grateful, and desperate for heroes who were still alive to celebrate. Bong gave speeches he hated, attended ceremonies that made him uncomfortable, and smiled in photographs that captured none of what was actually happening behind his eyes. He was polite. He was gracious. He was somewhere else entirely. The letters he wrote to Marge during this period are among the most quietly devastating documents in the personal archives of the Pacific War. He did not write about glory or victory. He wrote about the pilots still flying. He wrote about the missions he was not on. He wrote about the strange disorientation of being treated as a monument while still feeling entirely like a person. On February 10, 1945, he married Marge Vattendahl in Superior, Wisconsin. For one afternoon, Richard Bong was simply a 24-year-old husband starting a life. The photographs from that day show him genuinely happy, in a way that the Bond Tour photographs never managed. Marge was not a symbol. She was the woman whose name he had painted on the nose of his aircraft and carried through 200 combat missions as a reminder of everything worth surviving for. The happiness lasted weeks before the military found him another cockpit. America's jet age was arriving, and the Army Air Forces needed their most gifted pilots to help navigate the transition. Bong was assigned to Lockheed as a test pilot for the P-80 Shooting Star, America's first operational jet fighter. It was the right assignment for the wrong reasons. The military wanted his skills. Bong wanted to fly. The arrangement served both purposes without resolving the deeper tension in either direction. He approached the P-80 with the same methodical discipline he had brought to the P-38 a lifetime earlier. He read the manuals. He studied the systems. He flew carefully and reported precisely. His fellow test pilots noted that he had lost none of the extraordinary precision that had made him lethal over New Guinea. The jet simply demanded different instincts, and Bong was in the process of developing them. Then came August 6, 1945, a fuel pump failure at low altitude, a powerless aircraft over Los Angeles. A man with 200 combat missions and the best hands in American aviation, attempting to solve an unsolvable problem in the seconds available. The aircraft struck the ground, and America lost the one thing the war had produced that was genuinely irreplaceable. Richard Bong was 24 years old. On that same day, the Enola Gay dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima. The news of Bong's death was swallowed entirely by the announcement of a weapon that made everything he represented, the individual pilot, the personal skill, the face-to-face aerial duel, suddenly feel like artifacts of a world that had just ended. The irony was as complete as irony gets. The master of one era of warfare died on the day that era was permanently closed. But his legacy did not die with him. It had already separated from him and taken on a life of its own. The tactical doctrine that Bong demonstrated and Lynch helped institutionalize in the 5th Air Force became the foundational framework for American fighter combat for the next 2 decades. Energy management, the principle that altitude and speed are interchangeable currencies that a pilot must manage with discipline rather than spend recklessly in turning fights, became central to the curriculum at every American fighter school. When jet aircraft replaced piston fighters, the principle transferred intact, because physics does not care what kind of engine is producing the energy. In Korea, American F-86 Sabre pilots, flying against Soviet-built MiG-15s, applied the energy management principles that trace directly back to Bong's New Guinea campaigns. The MiG-15 was faster and climbed more steeply than the Sabre at high altitude. The Sabre was more stable and more controllable at high speed in a dive. American pilots who understood the energy equation, who climbed when they had advantage, dove when the geometry was right, and refused to be drawn into turning fights where the MiG's characteristics were superior, achieved a kill ratio of approximately 10-to-1 over the course of the conflict. The pilots who abandoned that discipline for aggressive instinct died at a significantly higher rate. The pattern repeated in Vietnam. The F-4 Phantom was a generation beyond anything Bong had flown, a supersonic beast with radar-guided missiles and no gun on the original production models. Early in the Vietnam Air Campaign, American pilots flying with missile-only armament against North Vietnamese MiG pilots who had studied Soviet and Chinese tactics, were performing far below the kill ratios that doctrine predicted. The problem was partly technical. The early missiles were unreliable. But it was also tactical. Pilots were not maintaining the energy discipline that had been the core lesson of every major American air campaign since New Guinea. The Navy's response was the establishment of the Naval Fighter Weapons School in 1969, known to history as Top Gun. The curriculum built at Top Gun reconstructed from first principles exactly what Bong had worked out empirically over New Guinea in 1942 and 1943. Energy management, positioning, patience, strike fast, break away, never stay in the fight longer than the geometry requires. The kill ratio for Navy pilots improved dramatically within 2 years of the program's establishment. The lesson had been relearned. It was the same lesson Bong had paid for in combat missions at 21 years old, distilled from the Wisconsin forests, where a patient boy with extraordinary hands had first learned that a perfect shot is worth more than 100 rushed ones. The P-38 Lightning itself survived the war in a different form. Kelly Johnson's design philosophy: twin engines for survivability, concentrated nose armament for lethal precision, performance margins that exceeded contemporary requirements, influenced jet fighter development at Lockheed for decades afterward. The same Skunk Works facility where Bong spent his final months test flying the P-80 later produced the F-104 Starfighter, the U-2 reconnaissance aircraft, and the SR-71 Blackbird. The institutional culture that Johnson built, the willingness to design beyond conventional requirements, to accept complexity in exchange for decisive capability, ran in a direct line from the Lightning to the most advanced aircraft of the Cold War. The deeper lesson in all of this is not technical. The technical part was important but replicable. What was genuinely difficult to replicate was the human part, the specific combination of institutional resistance, individual persistence, and the willingness of at least one senior officer to look past rank and credentials and ask only whether the idea worked. Every organization that has ever failed to adapt to changing circumstances has the same story in its archives somewhere. The idea existed. The evidence existed. The person who understood the problem existed. What failed was the structure that was supposed to convert good ideas into action. Whitehead's resistance to Bong's tactics in the spring of 1943 was not stupidity or malice. It was the entirely rational behavior of an experienced professional protecting the investments he had made in an approach that had worked well enough, for long enough, to become doctrine. Breaking that pattern required Lynch's political courage, Kenny's willingness to override his subordinate, and the blunt arithmetic of 11 minutes of perfect flying over a New Guinea airstrip that made the argument impossible to dismiss. The parallel in military history is not rare. Mitchell and strategic bombing, Guderian and armored warfare, Nimitz and carrier aviation. In each case, the idea preceded the institution's acceptance by years. The proof had to be demonstrated rather than argued, and the person who carried the idea paid a significant personal cost for the privilege of being right before the system was ready to admit it. What distinguished Bong from many others in this pattern was the quietness of it. He did not crusade. He did not write manifestos. He flew missions and filed clean, precise after-action reports, and let the gun camera footage speak for itself. Patience, in combat and in institutional politics, was his single most powerful tool. Now here is the detail that most accounts of Richard Bong's story omit, the one that closes the circle in a way that changes the emotional texture of everything that came before. Marge Bong, Marge Vattendahl, the girl whose photograph rode on the nose of the fork-tailed devil through 200 combat missions, learned of her husband's death on August 6, 1945, on what should have been one of the most joyful days of her life. She had been married less than 6 months. She had survived the entire Pacific War with its constant anxiety, its censored letters, and its casualty lists, only to lose him not in combat, but on a test flight over Los Angeles. Not to Japanese fighters, but to a mechanical failure on a sunny morning in California. She never remarried. She spent the rest of her long life in Wisconsin, and in her later years, she became one of the most active supporters of the Richard I. Bong Veterans Historical Center in Superior. She donated letters, photographs, and personal effects that formed the core of what historians now know about the private man behind the public record. The aircraft on display at the center, the restored P-38 Lightning bearing her name on its nose, exists in part because she wanted the story told completely. Not just the 40 kills and the medals, but the letters, the longing, and the cost. She understood something about Richard Bong that the military historians and the tactics analysts and the aviation engineers could not fully capture in their frameworks. He was not a weapon that had been built to optimal specifications. He was a person who had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately, to put himself between danger and the people he was responsible for protecting, and who had done it with such precision and such discipline that it looked, from the outside, almost effortless. The 40 kills with a visible record. What Marge knew from the letters was the invisible record. Every mission he flew back from, every bomber crew that landed safely because the P-38 with her name on it had been between them and the zeros. Every pilot who learned to fight differently and lived because of it. From a farm in Poplar, Wisconsin, to the deadliest fighter pilot in American history. From an idea that colonels laughed at, to a doctrine that shaped American air combat for 50 years. From 14 victories in 1943 to a record that has never been broken in more than 8 decades of warfare. Richard Bong did not change the air war over the Pacific by being louder or more aggressive or more politically connected than the men around him. He changed it by being more precise, more patient, more willing to wait for the shot that was certain, rather than take the shot that was merely available. 40 aircraft destroyed, 200 missions survive, one record, one name painted on the nose of a silver twin-tailed fighter, and one quiet man from Wisconsin who proved that the most revolutionary thing a person can do, in war or anywhere else, is to understand a problem clearly, trust what the evidence tells them, and refuse to stop flying until the work is done. That is why this story is worth telling. And that is why the name on the nose of that P-38 was never just a girl's name. It was a reminder, written in paint on aluminum, that even in the coldest and most precise kind of killing, someone is always flying home to someone who matters. And the distance between those two things, the gun sight and the name on the nose, is exactly the distance that makes a person worth remembering.